we've analyzed multiple character introductions in this series, and that's not the only thing I have to say about it. I have many other things to say about how good and bad this series is at handling certain topics and aspects surrounding media and art. We'll get to the bad the next time we talk about this very entertaining and captivating series. Stay tuned. Scratch that. Before we talk about the things this series does wrong, we've got to get a few more positives in. As we saw with Majima's introduction in Yakuza 0, subtext and context play a huge part in how effective an introduction can be. Keeping that in mind, we can deduce that when a character appears for the first time on screen, you don't necessarily have to call that their introduction. The character can be alluded to before they actually appear on screen, or they can appear on screen before their actual introduction. Let me explain. To establish context and subtext, you can utilize the prologue, where we can see the circumstances that led to the character's present predicament, an event that changed their lives, maybe, or an event that led them to the position they're in right now. The prologue sets the stage before we're actually introduced to the character. An example of this can be seen in how the character Shinada is introduced in Yakuza 5. In case you didn't know, Yakuza 5 is a game about dreams. There's a relatively dreamlike quality to Shinada's prologue. The scene begins with a tracking shot following Shinada as he walks in the hallway towards the entrance to the baseball field. The color in the room is very subdued, which makes the entrance door stand out more with its blindingly white color piercing its shine through the room. Shinada is about to walk into that entrance, and then the screen flashes to white, transitioning the cutscene to the field outside. Now, if that doesn't feel like a dream, I don't know what does. So how do we interpret this scene? Well, we can deduce that this is clearly a big and emotional moment for the character, and the part where he walks into the white light can be seen as his dream coming true. But then the screen flashes, and with that transition, the interpretation could be a back to reality moment. And if you know what happens to him after this scene, the interpretation makes more sense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The rest of the scene revolves around the baseball match, with Shinada's team ultimately winning the match. The prologue ends with a fade to white. The next scene begins with a shot of someone knocking on a door. Then it cuts to a shot of apartment paraphernalia, which signifies we're in the interior now. Similarly to Akiyama's introduction, the cutscene makes use of visuals to convey the character's current predicament. Shots of a messy apartment follow, conveying that the character is past his glory days as a baseball player. Or is he? Because realistically, he would be stupid rich at this point, right? So what's going on here? Was his career robbed from him? Those are the questions that this scene prompts. Now, I don't really need to talk about the rest of the scene because the prologue and those few shots introduce this character perfectly. We see him at what's presumably the height of his career, but after that we are introduced to him in a completely different predicament, prompting questions from the audience, which entices them to continue playing and watching the game to find out what may or may not have happened for him to be in this position. And that's another magnificent way you introduce a character. One thing we haven't talked about is the use of the debt collection as a vehicle for character introductions in this series. It was how Kiryu was introduced both times. He was introduced to audiences, those being in Yakuza 0 and Yakuza 1/Kiwami. Now, the question is, why? Why did they use the debt collection as a vehicle for character introduction more than once? Well, I think I have an idea. First off, most of the main characters in this series are a part of the Yakuza or ex-Yakuza. Second off, debt collection is pretty characteristic of organized crime. It's often done to showcase the power and authority a Yakuza holds over his or his clan's subjects of control. Whether it be small business owners that paid for protection or loan sharks, A Yakuza has to make sure that those that work for or owe them something are obedient and loyal. So for character introduction, it can be a useful vehicle because it can showcase almost all of the important traits a character may or may not exhibit, especially as a Yakuza, because the audience may have certain expectations for someone who is a part of organized crime. So it can be an opportunity for the writers to be subversive or meet expectations. In Kiryu's first introduction as a Yakuza, he's shown to be stern and respectable. He doesn't immediately resort to violence, he doesn't raise his voice or shout, he isn't particularly aggressive, he only resorts to violence once provoked to do so by the businessman he and Shinji are collecting debt from. He doesn't take the time to humiliate and or continue attacking him after he gets what he needs, which is the debt the businessman owes. He leaves with a simple, "Don't blame me, it's what you owe." This is in contrast to how he's introduced in Yakuza 0, where he's less seasoned and more still a rookie. He beats the person he's collecting a debt from into complete submission, almost completely knocking him out. He isn't particularly overzealous about it though, as he is still exhibiting his signature stoicism. Both introductions still very much establish Kiryu as stoic. So how does RGG go about introducing the protagonist that's going to replace Kiryu? How do they make sure they establish that this protagonist is very different to Kiryu? Let's find out in Yakuza Like a Dragon.
"20世紀最後の日か." 今世紀最後の昼飯でも行くか。なあ、イチ。
イチなら地回りに行かせましたよ。
大晦日なのにか。
カムロ町に盆も正月もありませんよ。町が動いてる限り取れるものは取る。それがしのぎの鉄則ですから。
Yakuza Like a Dragon is the first installment in the series to not feature Kiryu as one of the main protagonists. And those are some pretty big shoes to fill. So how do they go about introducing this protagonist? Well, the first thing we notice is that we're outside, in daylight. A crowd of people are walking by, while what appears to be a chase scene is taking place, causing a public commotion. The person being chased pushes past the crowd, while who appears to be the chaser is revealed, shouting expletives like "cum stain." So what does this reveal to the audience? Well, the perspective we're going to look at this from is that of an audience member who has played all the previous Yakuza games, being accustomed to Kazuma Kiryu as a protagonist. First things first, this scene starts with a public commotion, something Kiryu would never ever cause because of his social awareness. And chasing someone? That's probably not something Kiryu would ever do because Kiryu would never put himself in a situation where he would have to chase someone, except that one time where he had to chase one of his adopted children. But we don't talk about that because that was in Yakuza. Not to mention the very immature insults they throw at one another, which is very petty. And Kiryu would never do petty shit. So from these few seconds alone, we know that this person is very, very different to Kiryu. We pretty much know that RGG isn't going to just give us another version of Kiryu. Eventually, once it looks like the coast is clear, the dude who was being chased takes a moment to breathe, when suddenly he's surprise attacked by a screaming Ichiban. Now, would Kiryu ever do something so goddamn over the top? Can you imagine Kiryu jumping from the floor of the building, screaming, to surprise attack the person he is collecting debt from? No, I don't think so. Not to mention that it's over a matter so weird and petty. Adult videotapes with Animal. That's what that dude was selling. That's what Ichiban was chasing him over. If you asked Kiryu to handle a collection like that, even in his younger Yakuza 0 days, he would take that as disrespect. I don't think I need to say much more. These scenes perfectly establish how different Ichiban is going to be to Kiryu. Yeah, he's over the fucking top, he's ecstatic, he's a goofball, and he's not afraid to exclaim emotion. Almost the complete opposite of a stoic. So you, as a Yakuza veteran, know that you are in for a ride. The last instance of the way this series perfectly executes character introductions that I'd like to talk about is how the 3 lieutenants of the Dojima family are introduced in Yakuza 0. In these introductions, we see how foreshadowing is effectively used, so the introductions work better in hindsight, but I'd say they're still pretty good for a first-time player. The scene starts with an ominous establishing shot of the Dojima family office. We see a contrast between the taxi Kiryu is in and the building itself, signifying Kiryu's level of status in the Kojo clan at this point. At that point in time, he was still very much an underling. Fast forwarding to when he opens the door to the office, he walks into the room and we get 3 reaction shots of each of the lieutenants. Judging by how each of them reacts to his entrance, we can surmise quite a bit about how each of these men view Kiryu, and how they conduct themselves, and how different their personalities are. Awano reacts with a very repulsed face. Shibusawa is slightly annoyed, but the emotion isn't conveyed that much. And Kuze is very irritated. Kuze then proceeds to ask a very snarky rhetorical question. Shibusawa is a bit more professional and straight to the point, asking him if he knows why he is here to begin with. Kiryu's answer to that question seemingly confirms Awano's suspicions, who then remarks about how they could be doing something so much better right now, instead of dealing with Kiryu's situation. For the rest of the scene, everything we've assumed so far is only further confirmed. Awano, while not as aggressive as Kuze, is still pretty mean to Kiryu, even telling him to quit his damn whimpering. Kuze kicks the table at some point. Shibusawa still conducts himself with professionalism. Now, how does this scene foreshadow what happens in this game later in the story? Well, given the fact that they are all supposed to be lieutenants for the same family, they should have some form of cohesion and the dynamic of a team, right? Well, this scene right here presents to us that while they try to give off this veneer of cohesion, you can tell that something is off. The way their personalities should or could clash should make the idea of them working together seem dubious. Yeah, Awano and Kuze are pretty mean to Kiryu, but Awano is a bit more condescending and passive-aggressive about it, with that signature smug look on his face. And in what world would someone like Shibusawa work with these lames? Something's fishy, and we'll only find out later in the story why things seem so off, and why Shibusawa puts his hand on Kiryu's shoulder when he leaves the room. If you know what happens later in the story, you'll know that these 3 were never really working together, and that they don't actually like each other. Everything we see in this scene is an act, and looking at it from a hindsight perspective, it kind of shows. They're really trying hard to present cohesion, but I'd say they failed the task, just given how contrasting their personalities are. But that's just me. Now that we got those 3 introductions out the way, I think we can finally talk about something this series doesn't do that well. Something this series isn't good at. Stay tuned for that. The next time I talk about Yakuza. I mean it this time. It's gonna be pretty damn controversial, so if you have your pitchforks, or if you have pitchforks, please don't use them on me, and just hear me out, okay?
下手なくせに笑えない笑顔を見せた